Great. So we have completed chapter 20. I don't know how you felt about chapter 20, but hey, it was a lot of it was in your lifetime. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you thought it was interesting. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go back into one of the chapters that we synopsised at the beginning of the year, because remember I said that that another teacher, this is on YouTube, so I'm not going to say her name. Another teacher had said that they had not gotten through the entire book, and that there were places we should just kind of move on through. So we got to the end, which we did, but we still have 3 weeks left of school. So for the next 3 weeks, what we're going to focus on is the Civil War. It's one of my favorite topics. So I decided that's what we were going to do. And you guys didn't have the Civil War in 4th grade. You did have it in 3rd grade, but not all of you were in my 3rd grade class. In 3rd grade, let's be honest, was 2 years ago. You probably don't remember half of what I taught you. And in the chapters that you have here, it actually goes into a lot more depth about the Civil War, about the history of slavery, about how that all worked. So that's where we're going to focus our attention from now to the end of the year. Okay, that was my plan. I thought about a lot of different things. I thought about the 13 colonies that we had synopsised. I thought about the Gilded Age that we had synopsised, but that synopsis was really good, and I don't think there was much I could add to the Gilded Age. Okay, and you studied the Gilded Age last year, which you remembered, and so I thought, well, let's take an area that you guys really haven't studied in depth in a couple years, if ever, depending on the ones who weren't here in 3rd grade when I taught you. Okay? All right, so let's look at slavery. Okay? We are doing pages 138 to 141, but we're not actually going to get through all those pages. Okay? So I actually have attached 2 packet pages for today, but only do the one that it says in the instructions. Okay? Don't do both of them. All right? Okay. So, slavery has been in the United States of America since the beginning of the United States of America. All right? So, a lot of people tend to think of this country as slavery was only in the South. It didn't start until we were colonized. Till we became independent. All those things are not true. Okay? When we came over, because remember, the United States was actually owned by Britain. We were a territory of Britain. We were a colony of Britain. When we started coming over, as richer European people came over, they brought with them slaves. Okay. So slaves have been around since the original 13 colonies. So I'm covering this name because I made a mistake. So in 1619, okay, in Jamestown, yeah, that's what I put Jamestown, John Rolfe owned 20 slaves. Okay, remember John Rolfe? He is in Jamestown. He ends up marrying Pocahontas. Yes, John Rolfe. Okay, so John Rolfe owns 20 slaves, and the reason that he owns these 20 slaves is because John Rolfe is a tobacco farmer. Tobacco is a very labor-intensive crop. It takes a lot of time and energy in order to bring in a tobacco crop. So you have to strip the leaves, you have to dry the leaves. Even today, it's still stripping the leaves and drying the leaves. Okay, well, okay, maybe not today. 20 years ago, it still was. All right. And so they need a lot of people in order to harvest tobacco. So what they ended up doing was they ended up getting slaves. So there are records that John Rolfe in Jamestown had 20 slaves. Okay. And he wasn't the only one. There were a lot of people along the Chesapeake Bay. Now, granted, this isn't the North. This is Virginia. Chesapeake Bay, they're growing tobacco too, and they have slaves. So there is a very there is a larger slave population in the colonies than a lot of people think. Okay. Now, yes, this is the South, which is what people tend to think about. Jamestown is in Virginia, Chesapeake Bay is in Virginia. However, the colonists bought slaves from Massachusetts down to Georgia. They bought slaves. Okay. In third grade, we read about a slave girl named Phyllis Wheatley. Okay. The family is in Boston, Massachusetts. They go to get a slave to help with the housework. They see Phyllis. She's a little girl. She's very sickly. Mrs. Wheatley takes pity on her and brings her home, buys her and brings her home, and then nurses her back to health. They figure out that she's a pretty smart kid, and so they start teaching her how to read. They teach her how to write. And she actually writes a whole bunch of very famous early American poetry. She writes about the Revolutionary War. She writes about George Washington. She becomes a super famous poet, even of her day. Okay, so Phyllis Wheatley eventually, like some slaves of the time, she got her freedom. Okay. So in the beginning, in the 13 colonies, sometimes slaves would gain their freedom. The family would just let them free, okay? Or sometimes they would buy their freedom. Later on in history, they do still sometimes buy their freedom, but most percentage of slaves, when they're born into slavery, they are slaves for their whole life, and so are their children, okay? So it does change over the course of time. All right. In 1776, slavery was established. Okay. 1776. So the Declaration of Independence was written in 1776. And they had the opportunity at that time to say, hey, we don't want slavery in this country. They chose not to because the southern states said, we're not signing it if you get rid of slavery. And so what they did was they just moved the problem down the line. And if you studied with me in third grade, you would find out that they continued to move the problem down the line. They just did not stop. So at every opportunity that a problem arose regarding slavery, they just came up with a compromise or a different thing to do. So one of the most famous compromises is called the Missouri Compromise. Okay, because what happened was Missouri wanted to come in as a slave state, which would have made the states uneven. So instead, they said, oh, hey, let's have a compromise. And they made all these rules, and they let Maine come in as free and Missouri come in as a slave. And anything below Missouri was supposed to be slave states. Anything above Missouri was supposed to be free states. And they had this whole Missouri Compromise, which was, again, let's not really deal with the issue of slavery. Let's move it down, which is what you're going to see through this whole chapter, is that they just keep moving it down until finally it erupts in the Civil War. Actually, you're not going to see it in the chapter because it erupts in the Civil War pretty quickly. All right? Okay, so white Americans disagreed about slavery. All right, so divisions begin between the North and the South pretty early in our history. So what happens is the North and the South both have slavery. 1776, it was established. Yes? Okay. But what happens in the North is slavery tends to die out on its own, kind of. What the factory owners and people in the North, because the North went very factory and technology kind of thing for their day, they discovered it was just cheaper to hire somebody and pay them, and if they got hurt, just get rid of them, or if they got sick, just get rid of them, than to house, clothe, and feed a slave, whether they were sick or not. So what happens in the North is that they discover it's way cheaper to hire someone than to keep slaves, so slavery dies out. In the South, it goes totally the opposite way. Not only do they grow tobacco, which is a very high labor crop, but they also grow cotton, which is also a very labor intensive crop. It's intensive to plant, it's intensive to pick. At that time, there was no machine that pulled out seeds from the little cotton balls, so you had to pull the little cotton balls apart and pull out seeds. So it was a lot of labor. And the South did not grow as factories, the South grew in agriculture. So they had plantations. So plantations, remember we talked about, are really, really big farms. Okay? So the slavery grew because of the labor intensive crops. Then, because of the labor intensive crops, needing the slavery, the South had their whole entire economy based on slavery. All right. Now, don't for a minute think that the North didn't get some sort of money from slavery, because they did. All right. So in the North, slavery also provided money for their economy, but in a completely different way. So what would happen is, until the 1800s, because in the 1800s they make a law saying you can't do this anymore, but until that point, ships from New England states, so the New England states are like Maine, Massachusetts, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Connecticut, Rhode Island. See, because I'm thinking, was Vermont in there at that time? No, they weren't. So that's what they mean by New England. Some people include New York and New Jersey. They're not New England states, just so you know. But some people include them, but they're not. If you're actually from a New England state, they will tell you, no, it's Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. Okay, Vermont's included in there too, but at this time in history, there was no Vermont. All right, so what happens is ships go from the New England states. They go on down to the continent of Africa. Remember, Africa is a continent, not a country. Okay, on the continent of Africa, there are many countries, but Africa is a continent. So when I say they're going to Africa, I mean the continent, okay, of Africa. Yes, a lot of people, even adults, think that Africa is a country. It's not. South Africa is a country on the very south tip of the continent of Africa, but Africa is not a country. It's a continent. Okay, so what they would do is the ships would go to the continent of Africa. They would pick up slaves. Now, how did they have these slaves? Well, there was several ways. One was sometimes they go out and capture slaves, but they didn't do that often because they had to supply other ways. So when tribes in these African countries would fight each other, they would capture the people. So if Susie and Fred fought and Susie's tribe won, they would capture Fred's tribe, and then they would put them all in slavery. And so these white guys show up and say, hey, we'll pay you for some slaves, and they give them to them. Okay? Sometimes as the battle's going on, they get a prisoner of war. The battle's not over yet between the two tribes, and they would sell that person. Okay? So there was different ways that the white people got slaves. Okay? But those were some of the ways. So they would stick them on the ships, and they would return them to the South, where these ships would then unload the cargo, which were the slaves, and the slaves would be sold. So the ship person would get money from that. Okay, so he would sell the auctioneer the slaves, then the auctioneer sells the slaves to people. So he would buy them. The auctioneer buys them from the ship owner and then sells them to the people who want slaves. Does that make sense? Okay, so they were getting money from that. Not only did they benefit from actually directly trading slaves, but they also benefited from the cotton. Okay, sorry, I checked my notes because I know I'm in my next page. All right, so the cotton, which was farmed, harvested by slaves, yes, would be sent to on ships to New York City. Okay, and New York City would then process it And they would either keep it or they could sell it to England because England really needed cotton. Okay. England doesn't really have a lot of land for farming, and so they used the colonies here for a lot of that. We came and we sent them pelts and things, like beaver pelts was a big thing for the hats that they wore, and so cotton was also a big thing. So New York City merchants, they got wealthy off of the slavery as well, because they would profit not just from the slaves, but they would also profit from the cotton that the slaves grew. Okay? All right. So at this time in history, some preachers, I know it's hard to believe that is only some preachers were opposed to slavery. They were saying, hey guys, this is really un-Christ-like. Like, we're not showing love when we own people. And other people were like, no, I'm sharing the love of Jesus with them, because if they were still on the continent of Africa, they would never hear about Jesus. So I'm telling them about Jesus, and we're going to get them saved because of that. Which is kind of crazy to think about, because imagine if somebody came to your house today, grabbed you from your house, took you somewhere away, far away, you left your whole family, and then they made you work, and if you did not do well things, they would punish you, not like, oh, go to your room, but like, beating on you, and then they would tell you about Jesus. Would you be like, yeah, I want to know Jesus? You'd be like, are you kidding me? Okay, so this was the debate between the two sides. All right. So sentiment towards slavery begins to change in the North. So some things that create this change in the North, which we call an anti-slavery tide. So the tide comes in, the tide goes out. Okay, so slavery was in. Now people are starting to think maybe slavery's not such a good idea. So what they did, the things that contributed to this, was of course the pastor saying, hey, this is un-Christ-like, but also the Second Great Awakening. Okay, so the Second Great Awakening helped to raise anti-slavery because people started committing themselves to Christ again and saying, hey, wait a minute, how can you own your brother or your sister? Okay, even the Bible talked about that Israelites weren't supposed to enslave other Israelites. Don't slave your brother and your sister, yes? And so that doesn't necessarily mean, your biological brother or sister, but it meant your sister or brother in Christ. How can you own them? How can you enslave them? What are you people thinking? It's kind of what happened with the Second Great Awakening. All right, also financial reasons were one of the issues that spurred on the whole anti-slavery movement. So the North said, hey, if the people are free to choose where they work and what they do, free to get paid for what they do, they would actually work harder and work better. Okay. The people in the South said that, well, okay, that might be true, but you factory people, if your person gets hurt, you just fire them. If my slave gets hurt, I take care of them, nurse them back to house, they can go back to work. So we are actually the better. So yeah, they might not work as hard as your people do, but I'm telling you that it's okay, because when they get hurt, you just get rid of them, which was true, actually. If you worked in a factory, so say that you worked in some place where they sewed clothes, if you got a needle through your thumb, they just go, oh, that's bad, and they would just fire you. Okay, because they had lots of people to choose from. Lots of people wanted jobs. So if you didn't work out for them because you got hurt, then they would just go, bye, see you later. Okay. So they believe that financially, though, the anti-slavery movement, that if you let people work, that they will do their best if they are free to get paid. Okay. Third reason, a book came out by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Super famous book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Okay, see it's written right here. Uncle Tom's Cabin. Okay, Uncle Tom's Cabin was a book that was written to depict slavery. Okay, so people read the book and people were very upset about what they saw. Hang on a second. Okay, and they're like, whoa, if this is what slavery is like, we really need to get rid of it. So that is what happened. That added to the fuel. So some people say the pen is mightier than the sword, which means if you write about things, you can change people's mind easier than if you're trying to go to war with them. Okay, and that was kind of displayed here. A lot of people didn't really think about slavery or the impact on the slaves until Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote her book, Uncle Tom. Okay, something else that made people very upset and turned the tide was the Dred Scott decision. All right, so I was writing out the notes for Dred Scott and the dates weren't making any sense. So I went to a different source, actually like 4 different sources, which is why I tell you guys, go to different sources. So I went to several different sources and they all disagreed with what was printed where I was reading it. So this is kind of how it goes. All right. So Dred Scott, he is a man and he was born into slavery and he moved around with his owner. So his owner's name was John Emerson. Okay. So John Emerson owned Dred Scott. Dred Scott gets married in a free state to a slave. Okay, they have kids, and what happens is Dred Scott and his family, Mrs. Scott, they spend time in free states like Illinois and Wisconsin, and they spend time in free territories. All right. And sometimes they're actually even just left there with someone else. They hire them out to another family. And Emerson and his wife go other places. Okay? And this happens periodically. So John Emerson was in the military. He was a surgeon. And so he moved around some. And so when he gets out of the military, they move back to the South where there is slavery, Missouri. That's where they go. And so Dred Scott's like, hey, wait a minute. You know, I've lived in the North. I've lived in free territories. I've lived in free states. And I think I should get my freedom. So after Emerson dies, John Emerson. Sorry, I gotta keep looking at here for my name. After John Emerson dies, Dred Scott sues Mrs. Emerson for his freedom. Okay? So he's like, hey, I lived in free places. You need to let me please be free. And she's like, nah. And he even tried to buy his freedom. Remember I said in the beginning, you could, sometimes the slaves would go free, sometimes you buy their freedom, yeah? And they said, and Mrs. Emerson said, no, I'm not going to let you do that. So he goes to court, and the lower court says, yes, of course you can get your freedom. I mean, you were in a free state, you lived there, so we will grant you freedom. So Mrs. Emerson doesn't like that decision, so she brings them to a new court, which is kind of how it goes. So you have lower courts, and then you go all the way up to the Supreme Court of the state, and then you have the Supreme Court of the United States. Okay, so this is what they did. So the lower court said, yes, you get your freedom under the Northwest Ordinance. Is what they cited. They also cited Kansas, Nebraska, which is if you were a new territory, you could decide on your own if you were free or slave. Anyway, so the North West Ordinance banned slavery north and west of the Ohio River. And he lived north and west of the Ohio River, okay? Because he was in Illinois and Wisconsin. The Ohio River's like over here. Illinois, Wisconsin's over here, okay? And the territory. And so she didn't like that decision, so she went to the Missouri Supreme Court is where it ends up going. And the Missouri Supreme Court says, no, no, no. You are still slaves. So this poor family, this Dred Scott and his family are slaves today, and then not slaves, and then slaves again. And so they're back and forth being slave and free, depending on what the court is saying. So it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and Dred Scott says, hey, I should be free. And basically the Supreme Court says a couple things. They say, no, because you're property, and if I take my backpack into Missouri or into Illinois or into Wisconsin, it's still my backpack. Nobody can take away my property. My horse is still my horse no matter where I go in the nation. So since you're property, you are property no matter where you go in the nation. Okay? So that really upset a lot of people. That they said, nah, you are still property. You and your wife. Enjoy. Okay? They also basically said he didn't really have a reason to draw. He could not go to the Supreme Court because he wasn't a U.S. citizen. And you had to be a citizen. But he wasn't a citizen. He was property. So this set a really bad kind of precedent in people's minds. And it upset them a ton. Okay? So, Dred Scott, the Dred Scott decision, which is still on the books today because it went to the Supreme Court, you can Google it, you can look at it, you can read all about it, okay? So, the Dred Scott decision actually made people upset about slavery. Okay, does that make sense? All right, so let's continue. States' rights. So the nation was divided over states' rights, okay? The federal government was only supposed to have limited powers. Remember, the founding fathers were very concerned that a government could become tyrannical, that they could say, oh, we just want to do whatever, okay? And that it would be like before with the king, and they would just be making rules and laws that nobody had any say in. And so they wanted to limit the power of the United States federal government and give the states themselves more of the governing power. Okay, so there was a huge division between the South and the North. Here, let me just do this. My marker. Let's see if I can find a good marker. Okay. So we have the South and we have the North. Okay? And they had different ideas of the authority that the federal government had over the states. So the South, they believed in the 10th Amendment. Which states that anything not in the Constitution, no power in the Constitution that's not given to the federal government cannot be taken by the federal government. That's what that is. And so the problem was that, that they felt that they should be able to leave if they so wanted to. Okay? The South thought, let's get rid of the North right now. The South thought that the federal government was overstepping, we'll just call them the feds, The federal government was overstepping the Constitution by making laws about slavery. Remember, this is always slavery. Okay? And so they thought that all states should demand their rights, and each state should decide on their own whether they have slavery or not have slavery, and that no matter where the slaves went, they were always property. Okay? That's what they felt and thought, that they should always be property, and that the federal government should not be able to even make a law talking about slavery, because it should be up to the state. Now, they did try this in their whole, let somebody else deal with the problem. It was called Kansas, okay? They tried it in Kansas. And so what happened when Kansas was going to become a state was a whole bunch of people who never lived in Kansas came there, both for slavery and against slavery. And they fought each other, and they killed each other. People died. It was called Bleeding Kansas or Bloody Kansas because of the violence that went on there. They actually made up two different governments with this whole Kansas thing. One that was for slavery and one that was against slavery, and the two governments fought each other. It was chaos, and it was a mess, okay? So even though it sounds like a great idea, and if the people of Kansas were allowed to decide for themselves, it probably would have been fine. But what happened was people from all around, okay, that never even lived in Kansas, not a day in their life, decided to show up to Kansas and protest for their side. And it became very violent. So that was a problem. Okay? So South Carolina is the hotbed of protests. Okay? They have been battling for states' rights for a while. And who are they battling? The federal government. Okay? So they have been battling over tariffs. Oops, I spelled tariffs wrong. That's an A. Sorry about that. A-R. That's what happens. You get one letter wrong and everything goes. D-A-R-I-F-F. There we go. All right, tariffs. So they were battling over tariffs. So tariffs was an issue between the North and the South as well. So what happened was the North was factories, and they made stuff, but other countries made stuff cheaper because they'd been doing it longer. All right? They had the equipment and all that. And so to protect United States goods, what they would do is they would charge a tax on things coming in. So the other countries go, okay, fine, which happens today, guys. So the other countries go, okay, fine, we're going to charge taxes on your stuff too. So that affected the South because the South needed those things from other countries, and the South exported cotton to England. And England said, okay, fine, we are going to tax your cotton, okay, which made the demand for Southern cotton go down. So the South did not benefit from tariffs. The North did. The federal government decided that that's how it was going to be. And so South Carolina, way before the Civil War, okay, was battling against the federal government. All right? And so South Carolina was really worried when Lincoln was elected, okay? They were worried that they would not be able to keep their rights, especially over slavery, because they watched how they lost their rights over tariffs, okay? So they were very, very concerned about that. All right, and that is where we're going to stop for today, okay? We're going to continue tomorrow with these pages, and we will move on. All right? So I will see you tomorrow, guys.